Hey, what's going on, everybody? Connor here with another episode of the 10-Minute Strength Pod. It's been a little while. I keep saying, I feel like every time I come back on here, I say we're going to start doing more of this, and then we don't do more of this. I'm really going to try to start doing a little bit more of this. It's the fall, so probably be going from being on the floor for 45 to 50 hours a week down to probably 30 at most. So I'll have a little bit more time on my hands, so we're going to try to start doing more of this stuff. I enjoy doing it. Hopefully you enjoy listening to it. So we'll do what we can to do more of it. Today we're actually going to be talking about, if you look at the thumbnail, there's a picture of Jameis Winston. Well, recently he actually did an interview after, I believe it was practice, with the media, talking about coming back from his ACL tear. So tore his ACL mid last season last year, had to rehab, come back. And it's always interesting to hear athletes' takes on when they come back, how they did it, who they worked with, and what they learned. And it's funny, right? Jameis isn't the most articulate dude on the planet. Super nice guy. Looks like he's having a lot of fun in the interview. But athletes tend to really botch this stuff when they go to talk about it. And him in particular, he actually made some pretty good points here. We're going to watch that video, and then I'll kind of break down what he's trying to get across because it's really important information. So we'll start here.
So much about my body when I have the ACL, just the importance of other parts of your body being overcompensated because you're overusing something else. So just a holistic body, everything about your body, you have to be able to work certain things. Just because my knee hurt, that doesn't mean that I need to work my knee. I need to work my hips, right? I need to work my ankles. And you got certain things that we're all our body is so symmetrical. Right, you got your wrists, and then what are your wrists on the bottom half? Your ankles, and you got your shoulders up top. What are your shoulders? Your hips, you know what I'm saying? You got your elbows. What are your elbows? Your knees, right? It's symmetrical, and you just got to work different parts.
So he's actually right there. What he's trying to explain here is something called joint stacks theory, or joint stacks model. It was something that was theorized by Gray Cook and popularized by him, that our body is just a series of joints stacked on one another that alternate between stability and mobility. If we lose mobility at any given place, we're going to gain it somewhere else. And that's, I think, what he was talking about when it came to his hips. Right? He said he didn't need to work on his knee, he needed to work on his hips. And so the knee is a very stable joint. When the hips don't have the movement that they're supposed to have, you're going to gain that mobility somewhere else. And he just so happened to have it gained at the knee, which ended up being bad for him because he ended up tearing his ACL. So we're going to talk about this joint stacks model here for a sec. So again, like I said, it was popularized by a guy named Gray Cook. He's the FMS guy, if you know who that is. And basically states our body is a series of joints that alternate between stability and mobility. Each joint has an effect on the one above it and below it. So like Jameis said, when his knee went, it was probably his hip that was the issue. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times those knee issues come from ankle issues, and we'll talk about that in a second. And again, if we lose that mobility at one joint, we're going to find it somewhere else, either above or below. A lot of back pain is actually caused by tight hips and too much mobility in the spine. So if given a task, your athlete's going to complete the task, but what's going to end up happening is they're going to end up with movement dysfunction, all right, at the joints surrounding that joint. And it's not just the ones above and below. They're going to affect all the way up the chain, and we'll talk about that in a second too. It's incredibly important when both assessing and programming for your clientele that you keep this in mind. And just one more thing here, a lot of mobility problems are actually strength problems masquerading as mobility problems, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. So if you look at the body, right, we start at the foot. Foot's very stable. There's about 30 joints in your foot, and none of them move all that much. They're not meant to. It's meant to be stable. That's how we contact the ground. That kind of gives us the basis for our balance all the way up the chain. And you look at your ankle, right? So Jameis said your wrists are like your ankles, and they are. They're very similar. They're both very, very mobile joints. Then you have your knee. Your knee is a very stable joint. It's a hinge joint. It externally and internally rotates slightly, but it's mostly flexion extension. Then you've got your hip, right? Ball and socket joint, meant to be very mobile. We have a lot of people who really struggle with mobility in the hips, but it's meant to be very, very stable. Then we go up into the lumbar spine. That's supposed to be, go back to the hip. I said stable. It's meant to be very mobile. We'll go back to the lumbar spine here. That's a very stable joint. You don't get a lot of movement. There's a little bit of flexion and extension. You get some slight rotation, but for the most part, it's meant to be very stable. The thoracic, right, that's up here. That's this part up here. It's meant to be very mobile. It flexes, extends, and it rotates internally and externally. After that, you've got your scapulothoracic joint. So if you know what your scapula is, right, that's your shoulder blade. It's meant to be very stable in its space, right? It's meant to float and move, but it's also meant to be a very stable joint, all right? Then we have the glenohumeral joint, right? That's your shoulder. Again, very mobile joint, ball and socket joint, very much like the hips. Then we have the elbow. The elbow, like Jameis said, is the knee of our upper extremity. Then we have our wrists, right? They're the ankle of the upper extremity. And then you've got your hand. And again, your hand is meant to be very stable. There's not a whole lot of movement that happens within the joints of the hands. The wrist is very different, right? Very mobile. But the hand is meant to be very stable. So what Jameis was trying to get across is that more than likely he had some kind of hip mobility issue that caused too much movement at the knee, and that's very common, especially on the field of play. When we're going to change direction, sometimes we will internally rotate the hip, and that's mechanism of injury number one for non-contact ACL tears. All right, so losing that mobility at the hip is going to force your body, if you want to get through a certain movement, you're going to have to find that mobility at the knee, and that's a terrible thing, right? It's a recipe for disaster. Another time you see this happen fairly often is with ankle tape, and that's why I tell my athletes, like, if you don't absolutely need it, do not use ankle tape, because what's going to happen is it's going to limit the movement that your ankle is able to perform, right? And if your ankle can't perform those movements when we're working at high speeds and high velocities, we're jumping as high as we can, landing with a lot of force, cutting and all that, a lot of that movement's going to come from the knee. And again, that's how we get our MCL tears, our ACL tears, LCL tears, meniscus tears. There's a lot that happens just because of that ankle tape. So if you're an athlete and you sprain your ankle in the middle of a big game and you want to get back out there and you can't unless you tape your ankle or throw a brace on, more than fine, right? That's why you train. You're competing. This is the big stage. That's important. That's okay. All right. If you're an athlete who thinks that they need ankle tape or an ankle brace every time you step on the field to play or even to train, we need to kind of take a look at what's going on with your ankle mobility. We need to get in there and do some ankle strengthening exercises, because that's going to, over time, losing that mobility in the ankle is going to be absolutely disastrous for your knee. All right, so to kind of go back to the top of this, right, let's watch Jameis one more time.
So much about my body when I have the ACL, just the importance of other parts of your body being overcompensated. Because
all right, so he talks about overcompensating here, and that's what he means, right? If I don't have that mobility at the hip, I'm going to gain it at the knee. My knee is going to compensate for my hip not being able to do the movements that I need it to do. And again, that's a recipe for disaster. When we're in the gym, we can control all the variables. We can slow things down. But when you're on the field of play and everything's happening in real time, like if you have that movement dysfunction, it's absolutely going to put you in a position to completely blow out your knee. And that's what happened to him.
You're overusing something else. So just a holistic body, everything about your body, you have to be able to work certain things. Just because my knee hurting, that doesn't mean that I need to work my knee. I need to work my hips, right?
And actually right there, so he talks about knee pain. A lot of time knee pain can come from the hip or the ankle. If you've ever had somebody tell you that you have IT band syndrome, you need to roll out your IT band, more than likely, right, that hip issue is causing pain at the knee. Your IT band goes from your hip, it comes off the TFL and the glute and goes all the way down to kind of the lateral aspect of the knee on the very front part of it, and it can cause pain. I would say, actually kind of side note here, if we're talking about rolling the IT band, more than likely not going to do much. There's a couple techniques like Graston that'll help get in there and break up some of the adhesions in the fascia, but more than likely your IT band issue is coming from your TFL. Like 9 times out of 10, you get in there, you release the TFL, you'll end up with less knee pain. All right, that's kind of an aside here.
Work my ankles, and you got certain things that we're all like, our body is so symmetrical, right? You got your wrists, and then what are your wrists on the bottom half? Your ankles, you got your shoulders up top. What are your shoulders? Your hips, you know what I'm saying? You got your elbows. What are your elbows? Your knees, right? Like, so it's symmetrical, and you just got to work different parts. so much about my
Yep.
body.
So, I mean, he's right. Jameis is absolutely right. I mean, these athletes, when they talk about what they've been through and how they train, a lot of times they're not able to articulate it very well just because, they don't have a background in it. This is actually something that they're going through, not something that they learned and educated themselves on outside of what they need to do to get better. But yeah, Jameis Winston made a very good point here. And for everybody watching, all the strength coaches, even parents of kids that are training and playing, it's very important that you have a strength and conditioning coach or a personal trainer or an athletic trainer, whoever you're working with, that pays attention to detail when it comes to the mobility of your hips. Hockey, tennis, got every sport, but those two really come to mind. It's incredibly important that we maintain hip mobility because, again, if we don't, we're going to end up suffering the consequences down the road. A lot of times with hockey, you don't see it in the knee, you see it in the back. A lot of times with tennis, you'll see it in the knee. So that's it for today. Hopefully you learned something. Again, joint stacks theory, very important when you're programming for your clients. When you're training yourself, make sure that we maintain stability at the foot, mobility at the ankle, stability at the knee, mobility at the hip, stability in the lower back and the lumbar spine area, mobility in the thoracic spine, stability at our scapulothoracic joint. We want mobility in the shoulder at the glenohumeral joint, stability at the elbow. Actually, let's take this back. I'm not done yet. We're going to talk about the issues with the elbow because I work with a bunch of baseball players who pitch and have that UCL pain. And the reason for that is because they've either lost mobility in their shoulder and they've gained it at the elbow, or their pitching mechanics are off, or they're using a weighted ball program, which is a whole nother can of worms that I'm not going to get into. So maintaining that shoulder mobility is incredibly important. And with baseball, a lot of times what happens is we don't necessarily lose it here. We'll gain mobility in the scapula, in the scapulothoracic joint, and that causes the shoulder to lock down a little bit, which gives way to a lot of issues with the elbow. So for most sports, like baseball's very different when it comes to throwing overhead. There aren't a lot of sports that are like it. Tennis is another one. Swimming's another one where we're overhead. But we've got to make sure that we pay attention to detail, to shoulder care, neck care, your scapular stabilizers, all that, because if you don't, again, it's going to lead to disaster at the elbow. Stability at the ankle, mobility at the wrist, and again, we want that stability in the hand. And that's it for today. Hopefully you learned something. Jameis made a very good point. We should all kind of listen to what he had to say and make sure that we are mindful of that in our programming and training. Until next time.